Exactly, but reference was made to the caning of Charles Sumner.
That's true.
And he was caned by Preston Brooks of South Carolina, who went through his collection of walking sticks and canes and various. He pulled out something that was flexible. It was made out of gutta percha, South American material, hollow at the core, and it's hard, but it's brittle. And sometimes these canes had, if I can get a dagger out, it seems to be stuck. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, that is an example of the violence that was taking place in Congress increasingly in the late antebellum era in the 1850s. The mainstay of New England textile industry, 800, 900 pound bales of cotton that are being shipped up here by railroad, by merchant ships, and the spindles from textile mills. You can get these at the museum in Lowell. In fact, one of our governors just before John Albion Andrew, perhaps the greatest of all the war governors, John Andrew, a staunch Republican, a lawyer who helped defend John Brown, but his predecessor was Nathaniel Banks, known as the Bobbin Boy of Waltham. If you go to the town common or the city common in Waltham, you can see the statue of General Banks, because he began his life in a textile mill, pulling these off when they were full of thread and throwing them in a basket and a hopper and inserting a new spindle on the machine. My question to begin our second session, and James McPherson and a number of other historians have wrestled with the subject in the past 15 or 20 years, is the question of motivation. Why did these men fight? Why did they join up? Why did they fight, many of them bravely and ferociously, until they're killed or wounded, until the term of service is over, until the war is over? Why did these men fight? Arthur?
I think that goes back to what they were doing before the war actually started. I know, for instance, that in the mills, that was one of my first jobs here 45 years ago. And I said, people that work in a place like this, hot in summer, cold winter, but what was the alternative? Farming. Farming is hard, hard work. And these guys, all of a sudden the bandwagon comes through. There's a pretty girl sitting there, there's plenty of beer, there's something to eat. Join up. They're in the service, and they a lot of them couldn't read. They probably didn't know how to march.
They certainly didn't know how to march.
What's that?
They didn't know how to march, that's for sure.
Oh, well, after a while. But this was really, other than the farm, the first job that they probably had, and they were taught what to do and not to ask questions. And once they were in there, and I think they saw the horror of what went on in the battlefield, what else could happen?
One soldier described charging the enemy, and he said it was like being in a moving box. You had men in front of you, behind you, on both sides. There were sergeants keeping the file straight. There were officers behind you. Maybe an exceptionally brave or perhaps stupid officer would be in front of you, but there was no way out of this moving box. And once the box starts moving, you really have no choice but to go forward. You're not a man anymore, you're just part of a machine. Somebody else had a, yeah, Lev?
A lot of these soldiers and volunteers came from the same village, and they had men on either side of them that were neighbors and friends, and they weren't about to cut out and have somebody carry that story back that this guy was a traitor or a coward.
Showed the white feather.
The white feather, and the incentive, that incentive continues today in the military. The thing is, I know from the Marine Corps, you never leave a buddy out there. It's always this buddy system. I mean, and that's why and I think that's why a lot of men go into combat. They know that they could get hurt or killed, but they're worried about the opinions of other men on themselves. And I think that was even more so back then, in that Civil War and Revolutionary War too.
Yeah, it's like a bond, it's D-Day, you know, they were gonna fight with their soldier, like you said, with their buddy. I mean, it was a bond that you formed, that they weren't gonna turn around and leave the only person they had in the world at that moment was the person next to them, behind them. You know, they're going forward until they're told. And like you said, they're a machine. They forget about the humanity. They're gonna kill, they're gonna pillage, and they're gonna do what they're told and follow everyone else, and then deal with consequences later.
Jim?
If you deserted, you were shot or killed if you didn't make it. So there's an incentive as well.
Yeah.
Not like now when they throw you in military prison.
An incredible number deserted on both sides, North and South, but the South could afford the desertion, the hemorrhaging of their course, less than the North could. Dave?
Maybe I misinterpreted the question, but my understanding of what you were asking is why would people choose to serve?
Yeah.
You said Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers. Why would 75,000 men volunteer to serve in the Union Army? They weren't being drafted, they weren't being conscripted, they were asked to volunteer. And some of it is a history going back to the Revolutionary War, a choice of service to preserve the lifestyle we've become accustomed to, preserve the freedoms that we have. And even today's military, not so much Vietnam, because as you said, then people were burning their draft cards. But today's military is an all-volunteer force. And why would people volunteer? There are economic incentives. A number of people getting their college paid for by serving, but it still comes down to a choice to serve. And why would you do that?
Is it adventure?
Well, I think also, at least in the early part of the war, you know, when the war first began, you can't discount the fact that, you know, many of them signing up are very young. This is the first time they're gonna be away from home. They're gonna get a fancy uniform, presumably, a weapon. It's the whole, you know, 19th century Victorian romantic concept of warfare, you know. And even today, things haven't changed, at least with respect to, you know, when 19 and 20-year-olds go off to war, for the most part, they don't think they're gonna die, you know, they tend to think they're immortal. So I think in the first, when the rush to the colors, you had a lot of very naive people that really didn't know anything about war going off to fight this thing. And then of course, when you get into the real slaughter, when, you know, we get to, you know, Fredericksburg and all that, and enlistments go down, and then certainly after Gettysburg, you have to start drafting people to come in. You know, the dynamics change. So I think the question has to be phrased, you know, the same question proposed to the first part of the war and into the second half of the war, because, you know, like I said, after Gettysburg, you know, there's a real dynamic changes.
Good point. Different motivations
Yeah.
depending upon the period, the time. Yeah.
Didn't most of the people envision that this thing was gonna be over in 90 days anyways, that there wasn't gonna be a 4-year term or a year term? I was gonna go take care of business and I'd be home before you knew it.
A lot of people on both sides, many of them not in uniform, many of them would never be in uniform, the chicken hawks of their day. Yeah, they thought this was gonna be a 90-day war or less.
I have a question. You had mentioned in the first half that the Massachusetts militia was reorganized in 1850, around 1850. And I was wondering, what would have been the impetus for Massachusetts to feel as though it was threatened militarily in 1850?
John Andrew, when he took office January 1st of 1861, he immediately speeds up this process, but steps were taken even before he took office by people in either elected positions or people that had money, people that had political influence, who feared and or believed that war was coming. So they decided to strengthen and reinforce and improve the Massachusetts militia because they thought it was going to be needed very soon.
Did the abolitionists have a hand in that?
No, the abolitionists were still, like Wendell Phillips, insulting the American flag, saying that they couldn't take no pride in being an American, as Garrison was doing, burning the Constitution. Some of the abolitionists are talking about seceding from the slave-holding republic. This is immoral, this is wicked. New England should leave, New England should secede, New England should pull out. They talked about it during the War of 1812, near the end, the Hartford Convention. That kind of was a bust after they got the word of Andy Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. But the abolitionists did not think that slavery was going to be destroyed by this war. They did not think that this was a good thing, and most of them are apolitical. They're not involved in politics. They're anti-political.
What would have been the motivation for people to want to be in a more well-trained militia in Massachusetts? The average person, I mean, the question is, why were people willing to fight the war? Well, why, in the first place, why would somebody have been willing 10 years before the war began to start organizing and become involved in a militia? I mean, somehow that mindset must have been planted years before the war started.
Just as white Southerners, and especially slaveholders, feared, the abolitionists feared that these fanatics from the North were going to take their slaves, or free their slaves. There are people in the North who are very afraid of these violent, rapacious, fanatical states' rights, pro-slavery fire eaters, and the fear that their way of life up here in New England, as far north as Massachusetts, conceivably might be threatened. That we might have to defend our way of life. There was a captain in a Massachusetts regiment early in the spring of 1861, Captain Parker. His ancestor was at Lexington Common on Patriots' Day. The first shots were fired. It wasn't up in New Hampshire. It was right here in Massachusetts. Captain Parker he had a company of men from Lexington and surrounding towns, and there was a West Pointer there, some young pipsqueak, and he was out drilling the troops and cursing, just blood-curdling curses. And some of the men complained to Captain Parker. He's about 58 or something. He's quite elderly. So he confronts this young lieutenant, and he says, "Stop cursing at my men. In the military regulations, it says officers are not to curse men." And the young captain said, "Well, what do you know? What do you know?" And Captain Parker said, "Sir, I know that if I order my men to leave the drill field, they will obey my orders, and you will have no men to command." He died in 1864 in the siege of Petersburg. He was the real deal. His men loved him, he loved them, he led them until he died.
You know, Michael, I think part of the answer also may be, it is conventional to say, but true, that we are besieged with ways of amusing ourselves. This wasn't true in the 1840s and 1850s. And joining marching companies with the snappy drill and the uniforms, this was a form of fun back in those days. And the Southerners, you know, you read about the Richmond Rays and the Washington artillery and all that. What's the first guy who got killed on the Union side who drilled the Zouaves? Ellsworth, thank you, yeah. These guys would go, Ellsworth took his company of drillers around the country, you know, and they would perform and so forth. You know, and it's also a little known fact. You know, the South was a very violent place, or so it is said.
It was.
And the Cold Duello reigned, duels. And the South early on got the idea that it was going to have to fight. So they not only had marching companies, military companies, call it what you will, but around the 1840s and 50s, a huge number, apparently, of military academies sprang up. And having once gone to a military academy and loved it, oh, I wish I had been there. But anyway, that's when you got, for example, I believe the Citadel, isn't it, Michael?
I think the Citadel goes back to the Mexican War.
Okay, but there were a lot of military academies that sprang up in the South, or so I have read, you know, and that was because they thought they're going to have to fight someday. Now, one thing that wasn't answered, you might deal with this. People here talked a lot about why the Northerners fought. I guess it's self-evident why the Southerners fought.
Well, there have been all kinds of books done on it recently. Motivation, combat, why men fought on both sides. Someone referred earlier to Professor McPherson speaking at the law school some years ago. I was present with high school teachers from Maine and New Jersey. People traveled hundreds of miles to listen to him. He was sitting on the stage all day long trying to answer questions thrown at him by Dean Belville. and he held his own, and he spoke without notes, with a break with a break for lunch.
He was so infinitely superior to anybody else in the room, including the guy sitting next to him.
Yeah, right.
But anyway.
One of his books is for Cause and Comrade. I think it was based on a little shorter book called Why They Fought. He was doing research out at the Huntington Library in California, a lot of soldier records, a lot of memoirs and diaries. And he says that there was a difference in motivation between our troops in World War II. He claims that German troops, British troops, American troops, the GIs in World War II weren't fighting for the flag. They weren't fighting for FDR. They were fighting for each other. Small unit cohesion, group cohesion, and fighting for each other and often dying for each other. And the cohesion, when the casualties become so horrendous that unit begins to dissolve, so does the cohesion. But that in the Civil War, unlike World War II, and it raises the question of whether the Civil War was the first modern war or the last traditional war, or was it something in between? McPherson and others have argued about this, that the soldiers in the Civil War were fighting for the Union, or were fighting for slavery, or they're fighting for Southern independence, or they're fighting, as Shelby Foote famously said, because y'all are down here. What are y'all doing down here? Why don't you go home? So the motivations vary, but ultimately something like 3 million men and several hundred women served in uniform on both sides. And over 620,000, that's one estimate, died. In fact, if you compare the death rate in the Civil War with the population and our population today, the losses, the proportionate losses would be something like 6 million people. Can you imagine people voting in an election for a candidate or a party or a cause they knew would cause 6 million deaths? Can you imagine them re-electing someone, North or South, that was presiding over that slaughter?
You know, Michael, there is one other factor too that has not been mentioned, and I think people would argue about this. There was just a fantastic amount of arrogance among the Southern aristocracy. They were sure that one senator's worth at least 10 mudsills. They called the Northerners mudsills, which was a term of opprobrium for people who had the lowest kinds of jobs in society. I don't personally think there's such a thing as a low kind of job. My view is work and deserves respect, but that's what they said and thought. and this arrogance, I think, had something to do with their eagerness for battle, at least among the upper class.
The mudsill theory of society was the idea that no matter how poor you were, how ignorant, how illiterate, how backward, some hillbilly, a lint head in a textile mill, if you were white, you were above the mudsill. If you were an educated black, a free black, one of the aristocrats living in Charleston, there are black slaveholders in every slave state. No matter how intelligent, how much money you had, you're below that mudsill. It's a strict racial dividing line. Dan?
Yeah. One thing that hasn't been brought up, and it's affecting what was going on before this conflict started, and during the conflict. It was beginning of the era to transmit information, news, the news media. What was going on with the news media just before and at the start of the Civil War? We have a lot of opinionated news people now that are making up our minds for us. Was the same thing going on at that time?
Absolutely.
I think it was.
There were war correspondents embedded with the troops, north and south. All kinds of conflict between the journalist and the generals. If the journalist is making a general good, he's going to get special access and inside stories. And if the journalist is making the general look bad and pointing out that he ordered some disastrous charge or was cowardly and ordered a retreat for no reason, that reporter, he may file one story, but he's going to be banned from the lines. He may be put under military arrest. But in the campaign in Western Virginia, McClellan's first real actions and Rosecrans and some of the other Union generals, there were 2 Confederates who were captured at one of the early battles. And they're out of harm's way. They're just kind of watching what's going on around them. And here comes a team of horses pulling a telegraph wire that's unrolling on a spool. And one Reb says to the other, "We're whipped, Bob. The Yankees got the telegraph. How can we possibly win?" They were taking communications into battle with them, especially in the north. The south is slower on that, but northern technology, northern industry is helping enormously. At Bull Run, young telegraph clerk, Andrew Carnegie, is just north of the fighting. He's serving as a telegraph clerk. He's relaying reports from the front to Washington. So it's not too long before you have telegraph operators and the wires spreading throughout wherever the Union Army goes, all over the occupied South. News is being communicated very rapidly. And reporters are filing stories, and the Union surgeon's diary that edited Frank Dyer, he resented these reporters. He said they often got it wrong. But then he writes letters home to his wife in Gloucester asking her for news about what's going on, because he's just a regimental surgeon or a brigade surgeon, and he feels that she's getting more news and she's getting it faster than he is. He's got the small picture, but he feels that his wife Mariah is probably getting the big picture back home.
So don't you think that the young fellow up on a farm somewhere in Maine or New Hampshire is getting the word of what's going on through the news media, and it's making up his mind, gee, is this a cause that I should join up and belong to the cause and overcome the slavery issue? We all agree it's slavery is underneath this whole thing somewhere. And you can talk about economics and the other things, but slavery is the basic issue. And the minds of the people are being made up by the word that they're getting through the media, whatever it is, probably newspapers.
A lot of newspapers. Americans were avid newspaper readers. Americans who were illiterate would stand around in groups while somebody read the newspaper to them. Issues of newspapers were passed from hand to hand until the paper disintegrated. We were news junkies. We're very active and involved in politics. We follow political news. We follow elections. This war comes along, we're following what's going on in the war as best we can find out. Yeah, Arthur?
I don't know about everybody else here, but I'm a History Channel buff, especially when it comes to something like the Civil War. I'll watch that. I just learned recently that, especially in the second term, Abraham Lincoln spent a ton of time at the Western Union office listening to reports coming back in to the front. And the other thing too is that they wanted, the United States wasn't interested in expanding the system so much so that they approached Russia and say, we'll put cables all along Russia just to be able to reach there, because they couldn't get across on the Atlantic. And the Russians said, well, no, but for the same price of this idea, we'll sell you Alaska. And then William Seward bought the whole idea.
Arthur's right. Lincoln spent a lot of time, not in the White House, but at the telegraph office. He's hoping for news. He's hoping for good news. And in the first couple of years, the news is seldom good. He also spends a lot of time down at the War Department and at the Naval Yard, the Anacostia Naval Yard, watching experiments with new types of weapons. He was interested in any kind of weapon that could kill men faster and more efficiently and get this war over with and end the suffering. Think about Harry Truman and the decision he had to make in 1945, widely criticized, but he was a man on the spot. Lincoln is a man on the spot for the North during this horrible war.
Doesn't that make it the first modern war? Because you think about communication, the innovation. I'm reading the book Lincoln and His Admirals. I forget who wrote it.
Simmons? Craig Simmons? Yeah, I know it.
I never realized how involved. I mean, he basically ran the Navy after a while, and it's amazing. But anyway, I think it's the first modern war because of the technology of communications. Because now war is all about. I mean, how do we even know what's going on in Libya? Iraq won. We knew immediately when we were dropping bombs on Baghdad. World War II in Vietnam, there was a slight delay, maybe 12 hours till they filmed it and got it out. But now we know within 20 minutes if we're and Lincoln being in the office, you know, the Western Union, he wanted immediate updates. To me, that makes it a.
And while he's waiting for the telegraph to come in, he's telling dirty jokes to the telegraph operators. Did you hear the one about the farmer's daughter? I mean,
You know, I was telling Priscilla at halftime that I had on my television program once a Chicago Tribune reporter who wrote a book called about Gatling, Mr. Gatling's wonderful invention or something like that. And it really wasn't about the Gatling gun alone, not at all. It placed the Gatling gun in the context of the 1900, the 19th century's explosion of technology, which is summed up by saying that, as I once read, in 1800, it took longer to go from London to Rome than in Roman times, because the Romans kept the roads up, and the roads stank in 1800. By 1900, you had the telephone, the telegraph, railroads going 90 miles an hour, steamships crossing the Atlantic in 5 days, you know, et cetera, et cetera. Somebody even invented the fax machine around 1861 or 2, but it really didn't do anything for over 100 years. And if you want a really fascinating story about technology, and I haven't even mentioned medical technology, which began burgeoning in the 1870s and 1880s, you should get her, Rebecca, what the hell is her name? Well, call my office and they'll tell you what the name of the book is, and you can get a free copy of the television program. It's amazing. And this war happened right in the middle of it. All of a sudden you got the telegraph, so people like Grant are exercising command over thousands of miles. You got the railroad, so they're moving troops hundreds and hundreds of miles in a day or two or a few days. You got steamships on blockade. You've got the beginnings of repeating rifles. Photography, for sure. You know, what was that famous comment, Mike, of the death of Antietam and Oscar and Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. said it's as if they delivered war to our doorstep because the picture was on the front page. So this war was fantastic. It was right smack in the middle of everything. And frankly speaking, although the Union did adopt a lot of it for, I guess, what people consider good and sufficient reasons, they made some big mistakes. They did not adopt the repeating rifles early enough, and they did not adopt the Gatling gun, except for Ben Butler and a few other people.
Well, Custer made the same mistake. He didn't take his Gatling guns to the Little Bighorn.
That's right. And
the repeating rifle was not adopted soon enough because General Ripley in the Ordnance Department of the War Department, Ordnance Bureau, he said we couldn't give the troops repeating rifles because they would fire too often. They would waste ammunition. Bureaucrat. Jim.
You talk about technology making communication so wonderful, but yet when I read about the Civil War, a lot of the blunders in the battles is because they didn't have good communication from the generals to their subordinates that were maybe 2 towns away. They needed to get them there, and for some reason, there was miscommunication.
The
We couldn't
telegraph didn't
find
go
store-
everywhere. The telegraph did not go from headquarters down to
Right.
brigade or division or
Right.
regiment level. I mean,
Brings us back to, though, it was closer to the old wars fought in that respect versus the modern wars where you have good communication.
I'm looking for the photograph. It's got troops in it. Just to the right of the photograph of W.B. Du Bois, who was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, after this war. If you look at that top of the smaller photographs, you'll see Union troops in a trench and 2 officers standing on the top of the trench. That's called braving the fire of the enemy. In other words, I'm going to show what a man I am. I'm going to show how brave I am. I'm going to show my courage and display my honor by standing up on top of the trench or on top of a rail fence, like one of the Union heroes at Big Bethel in Hampton, Virginia in the spring of 1861. I'm going to rally my troops by standing on the fence, waving my saber, and some rebel, pow, and there he goes. So in that sense, that's an example of this being the last or one of the last traditional wars. This is a kind of tomfoolery you saw in Crimea, you saw in the Napoleonic Wars, you saw in the Revolution. But I don't know that, I hope that none of our men and women in Afghanistan are putting themselves at risk in quite so foolhardy a way.
Get down, you damn fool.
Well, so, yeah, Oliver Wendell Holmes. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was wounded at Antietam. His father's out searching for Captain Holmes, fears he's dead. He's wounded again. I think it's a minor wound at Fredericksburg. But in the fighting around Washington, D.C., General Jubal Early has come down the Valley of Virginia, and he is going to capture Washington, or at least try to create a diversion, try to force Grant to send troops from Petersburg to weaken his lines to save the capital. And who was there in the Union fortifications surrounding the city but Abraham Lincoln? And Lincoln gets up on top of one of these trenches for a better view. And Holmes, by now, is a combat veteran. He's been blooded. And he is down in the trench, and he yells up at him, "Get down, you damn fool." Only to realize that it's his commander-in-chief.
Who was being a damn fool.
And Lincoln obeyed the order. Lincoln got down. Yes,
Could I
Les.
just swing back to the media thing?
Sure.
But, didn't Lincoln squash, of course, habeas corpus and freedom of the press during this whole episode?
Throughout the North. He eventually extended the suspension of habeas corpus from Baltimore to all of Maryland and eventually to all of the Union states.
And freedom of the press, likewise.
And freedom of the press. If you like big government, if you like what our folks in Washington are doing today, then you can thank Mr. Lincoln. If you don't like it, then you could also thank Mr. Lincoln.
But Mike, isn't it also true that Honest Abe always blamed the generals for the suspension of habeas corpus, saying things like, well, Burnside thinks that we've got it suspended, so what can I do? That's not true?
His generals, telegraph or no, he couldn't always control them. So Ben Butler decides that he is going to seize a hotbed of secession, Baltimore, and captures it, and puts cannon on the hills in the city, and you got martial law in Baltimore for the rest of the war. But he essentially takes Baltimore out of the fight, and his reward is to be sent to Fort Monroe without any communications or horse or anything else, and he's just parked there. But he can't stay out of trouble. He starts receiving fugitive slaves and refusing to return them to their owners. He says they're confiscated. They're contraband of war. I'm not going to return them. You people are in a rebellion. If you want to sign an oath of loyalty, I'll return your slaves to you. But if you're going to fight against the U.S. government and the Constitution, then I'm going to seize any of your property I can get my hands on. But Burnside, Larry mentioned, Burnside, after a disaster at Fredericksburg, was removed from command. He had asked to be removed from command before the battle. He said, I'm not competent. I'm not capable of commanding this army. He knew that he had reached or gotten above the Peter Principle. Lincoln needed a commander. He tried other commanders. He said, no, you're it. So after the disaster in Fredericksburg, Burnside is sent to be the military governor, the superintendent out in, is it Indiana or Ohio?
I think Ohio, but I'm not sure.
The guy that's running for governor there,
Oh, right.
he is a hot secessionist. He's a copperhead. They call
Yes,
Vallandigham.
yes, Vallandigham.
Clement Vallandigham. They called him copperheads, like the poisonous snake. They identified themselves with a piece of copper cut out from a penny that they would wear in the lapel. And these people were virulently racist, hated the Union government, hated the Republican Party, hated the Lincoln administration. And Vallandigham is going to run for governor and try to take his state out of the war. Burnside stupidly arrested, makes him a martyr. And Lincoln says, let him go. They send him into Confederate lines. Confederates don't want him, don't trust him. They send him to Canada. So Vallandigham wages his campaign for election as governor of Ohio from Canada with Union agents shadowing every move. He's overwhelmingly defeated. One less problem for Mr. Lincoln. Some years after the war, he's defending a man in court accused of murdering another man in a barroom brawl. And lawyer Vallandigham is demonstrating that his client did not shoot this other man, did not murder him. That in the fight, the other man was going for a gun that was stuck in his waistband, in his trousers behind his back, and as he was pulling out his revolver, it went off. And as Vallandigham is demonstrating this to the jury, the revolver goes off, and he dies the next day. But, the jury acquits his client. A good lawyer will go to any length. Let me ask a related question to first modern war, last traditional war. Was this a total war? That's another question that historians have spilled a lot of ink on. Was this a total war?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
In what way?
Well, you take a general like Sherman and his march to the sea. He destroyed everything, totally. He brought the war to the people of the South, and he took away their livelihood, their crops, industry, whatever they had, he took away. Destroyed railroads. I mean, he went through like the blight that the locusts caused in this country, in the early 1920s or so. I mean, he just destroyed the South, and that is total war. Well, when you go after the general population and take away their sustenance, you're a total war. You're a total war. And I can only think from my experience in Vietnam. I mean, when you go to war, and I'm just flashing back to what you asked about why these people went to fight. I can only speak from my experience and my family's experience in the Second World War and Korean War. I chose to go. I joined because I felt it was my duty. And it's true. When you go to war, you don't think about dying. That's the last thing that you think about until you're there and you see it. Then war is real, and it's an awful thing to see. Anybody that has been to war knows what I'm saying. And the war was the first modern war because of the weapons that were used. And it was the last traditional war because of the tactics that were used. Let's not forget that they went from a regular smoothbore musket to a rifle musket, mini ball, which was accurate.
You know, the musket, you had to go up to within, say, 50 yards of a person to you know, actually bring them down. And with a rifled musket, you know, you were good for 100, 200 yards. You know, so I mean, it was vast improvements happened during the Civil War.
Thank you for your comment. Your name?
George.
George, thank you, George. George is absolutely right about Sherman. If you look at James Reston's book, New York Times columnist, Sherman in Vietnam, or Sherman's March, he spends an entire book. It was serialized in the New Yorker, but he spends an entire volume comparing Vietnam with the American Civil War, and specifically Sherman's march across Georgia from Atlanta to the sea. Much more recently, there is a wonderful novel by E.L. Doctorow. He wrote Ragtime. He did a number of other novels. And he's got a book simply called The March. And it's told from the viewpoint of all kinds of characters, black and white, northern and southern. Absolutely fascinating. I didn't find a single mistake in it. The dialogue is invented, but everything that he says, everything that he describes, either did take place or could have taken place. Sherman is practicing chemical warfare. His troops are burying containers in the ground that will poison the soil for generations to come. And Allen Garganis, an oldest living Confederate widow, tells all. He has the character, the narrator of this huge novel, flying over Georgia, looking down at the 3 lines of march that Sherman's troops took across the state, and saying that the foliage was a different color, that you can see 3 bands of different colored vegetation where Sherman was.
But you know, Mike, the one difference that people do point to, and I hadn't known about this, and this, of course, bears on what I'm about to say. Sherman, unlike the Nazis, unlike the Russians, heaven help us, unlike the Brits and the Americans because of carpet bombing in World War II, Sherman didn't kill the population willy-nilly. And if you define, you can define total war either of 2 ways, I guess. And if you use the definition that says you gotta go after the population and try to kill them, then it was halfway a total war.
You know, I'd also point out too, that if we define a total war as destruction of, you know,
Sherman didn't try to kill the population.
Right.
If we define a total
He took
war,
away their sustenance,
right,
which is the same thing. But I mean, it's not declaring war on the individual.
Well,
Right,
you
but
know, let me ask you this, George. Is it the same thing? Because Sherman cut 3 swaths, as I heard an Englishman say on the radio today, 3 swathes through Georgia. But that left the most of Georgia unscathed.
Well, he destroyed all his supply lines in back of him.
Right.
His troops had to live off the land.
Right.
Forage liberally.
That's right. And
They did.
that again is bringing war to the population.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
What is your definition of total war?
Well, there are some people, Mark, what's his name?
Really?
I think so, who think that total war means that you go try to kill the population as well as destroy the country.
The Germans and Russians.
what I'd like to point out too is that, you know, if we're gonna define a total war as destruction of the enemy's property, then just about every war that's ever been fought has been a total war, because what did the Spartans do in the Peloponnesian War when they invaded Athens? They burned all their crops, right? So, you know, you can't use, you know, economics alone as a definite total war, but I agree with Dean Belleville. I think, you know, yeah, obviously in a total war you're gonna destroy the enemy's crops, but unlike World War II, you know, when the second half of World War II, the bombing campaign changed to, you know, from strategic bombing to killing large amounts of the population, they became legitimate military targets in terms of targeting. So I think if you're gonna define a total war, it's not only, it's a combination of, yes, you're gonna destroy the property and it means to make war, but you're also gonna kill large amounts of the
But you know, the
population.
other side of it, from George's standpoint, would be that while this is true today, what Sherman did had not been the practice since, I think, the Treaty of Westphalia, where because in 1600 or something, 59, 60, because there had been such destruction in Germany that they decided they have to outlaw going after civilians and their property. And so, you know, there's a wonderful scene in Gettysburg, the movie, which I've only seen 35 or 40 times. Every time I do exercise. There's this wonderful scene where Lee says to who was his aide? Anyhow, he says, Captain, you will make sure that the men behave properly. Because he had asked him, are the men, you know, taking things from the people? And he said, oh, they're behaving very well, Your Honor, although, I mean, General, although I must admit it would be easier if the Yankees had not, you know, ravaged Virginia when they were down there. Mm-hmm. And Lee looks at him and says, you know, with this dignified thing, and he's rebuking him. And he says, you will ensure that the men at all times behave properly, and you will notify me of any failures to do so.
And
So
that is such claptrap.
Yeah.
General Lee says one thing.
That's true.
His troops do exactly the reverse. There's a Kentucky lawyer who's written a huge book about retreat from Gettysburg, and certainly it was a military disaster for the South and for Lee's army. But in terms of the provisions, the fodder, the horses, the sheep, the goats, the chickens, well, the chickens probably didn't make it. They were eaten immediately, but they took enough animals and enough forage and enough crops and other possessions from Pennsylvania, from Gettysburg all the way back south across Maryland, to keep Lee's army, this historian says, going for another year. They extended the life of the Army of Northern Virginia for at least a year based on what they grabbed in Pennsylvania, because they had nothing to eat in Virginia. It had been thoroughly cleaned out and fought over. And this Gettysburg campaign is in part, and becomes totally after his defeat, a resupply and a reprovisioning campaign.
And he said so when he was trying to make when he was trying to downplay the fact that they lost. He said, well, my reasons for going in were blah, 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 and one of them was complete resupply.
Yep, yep.
Who's the guy from Kentucky? He is such an avid Confederate. I'm telling you, he would secede today, and yet he's saying this. I know the guy. I met him. You know,
Helen or Jim can think of the name. I'm blocking it.
Begins with a B. I'm blocking
it
too. But trust me, this guy is somewhere to the right of Jefferson Davis when it comes to the Confederacy.
Who was the greatest general in the war? You got two candidates on the wall over there. Who won?
The guy who won.
Yes, Arthur.
I saw something the other day that I really didn't even know it existed. That General Lee made one of the most grievous mistakes of any military commander ever in Pickett's charge. He told Longstreet, who was standing next to him, and Longstreet said, why don't we just go around and attack Washington? Why? Because we can't take this. From where the Confederates were to Little Round Top was a mile-long stretch of field. Lee said, no, the enemy's there, that's where we're going to fight them. He lost, out of 12,000 men that started that charge, 5,000 never came back. And I don't know, it just seems to me that that's a ridiculous, you know, I talk about modern wars, you don't see that anymore, but that just seems to.
So Arthur, why did he order the assault?
He was there, he wanted to defeat the he said, he said before that he was gonna take those hills, and he said if Stonewall Jackson were here, we'd have had him already. But I'm not sure what you mean.
That's Douglas Southall Freeman's verdict on the Battle of Gettysburg in his 4-volume biography of Lee. The chapter in Gettysburg ends with one sentence. It says, Jackson is not here. Whether Jackson would have saved the day or made a difference, we don't know. But Lee is going to go right at him. He's the son of a gambler and a high-stakes politician. Family loses most of its fortune. His demeanor is quite different from what he is inside. He is an extremely aggressive individual.
And I also point out that he wasn't the only general that made a mistake of sending troops into battle like that. I'm thinking of, Burnside at Fredericksburg, that was futile, attacking Murray's Heights. And of course, if you fast forward from Gettysburg 11 months to the day, June 3rd, you got General Grant at Cold Harbor sends his troops into battle, and he suffers almost the same number of casualties as at Gettysburg. All the difference is he sends 50,000 men into action versus Lee's 12. But it's remarkable because most people celebrate Pickett's charge as a display of great manhood, and they condemn Grant. And statistically speaking, more Southerners fell at Pickett's charge than they did in comparison to the number went in it than they did at Cold Harbor.
Lee has in fact repeated the mistake he made at Maury Hill against McClellan of all people.
Yep.
Although McClellan had artillery, and he also had the Navy and the James River protecting his left flank. But Lee orders an assault at Maury Hill that is a bloodbath. And almost exactly a year later, you have Pickett's charge.
And if you ever watch movies of World War I, 50 years later, machine guns, artillery of remarkable power, and they did the same damn thing.
Yeah, 1916, the Somme.
You see them going
50,000
over the
British
trenches
down one
in line.
day.
Will they ever learn, kind of a.
It's easy in hindsight to say, yeah, he screwed up,
That's
because
right.
we know what happened.
right.
But at the time, he didn't have all the information that we know now.
And not only that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
He thought the center point was the weakest part of the Union line,
Why did he think that, Jim?
because I'm guessing, in past battles, they had strengthened the flank more than anywhere else.
And why would they have strengthened the flanks by July 3rd at Gettysburg?
Because he hit the flanks on both flanks the day before.
He tried to tear up both flanks of
Yeah.
Meade's army. And he assumed,
That's right.
he reasoned that they must have weakened the center.
Yeah. He also planned a rear assault, which never made it.
She never made it.
He also didn't know the amount of troops they had behind that front line at the angle and along the stone wall. So, it's easy to say that now, but
And also, in Lee's
what he had to work with.
in Lee's defense, let's remember that this is the Army of Northern Virginia who had pummeled the Union Army time and again all the way up to Gettysburg, and he also knew he was attacking an army being led by George Gordon Meade, who had only taken command of the army 5 days before.
On the
So,
march.
I mean, you have a very confident commander with veteran troops who had proved time and again that they could kick the Yankees' butt going into Gettysburg. So, you're absolutely right. It's very easy to look back in hindsight and say, oh, you should have done this rather than that. But, putting yourself in Lee's shoes at the time, I'm not so sure I would have made any decisions any different than he did, based on what he had to work with and what he knew.
He's an overly confident commander. He believes in his men. He thinks they can attack hell itself. And after it's over, he goes out on the field to welcome the survivors back, and he tells them it is all my fault.
And he was a risk taker too, and
It's all
look
right.
at Chancellorsville. He took a great risk dividing his army and it paid off. So this is a guy that knew that if you take calculated risks, they
Jim,
can
why is
pay
he
off.
taking those risks?
Well, he had to. I mean,
Why?
well, because he was fighting a vastly superior army, and he had to take great risks in order to try to even the odds.
Are you saying that the South couldn't win a war of attrition?
No, I don't think the South could have won a war of attrition.
Could we win such a war against China?
No.
Probably not.
No.
You know.
Probably not.
Well, the answer to that might be that the ratio of casualties is stupendous when you consider the attacker versus the defense as early as the Civil War because of the mini ball rifle. But Lee was a guy who was like the Paul Bear Bryant of his day. He's gonna just boom, and he refused to accept that the South could fight. I won't call it a war of attrition because I agree with what people said about a war of attrition. That the South could fight on the defensive, simply gunning down the Union soldiers as they did at Fredericksburg and as they did at Cold Harbor, and make the war so painful for the Union that it would quit if he fought in that way. And instead he would send his men, because he was this aggressive guy. He had the greatest ground game until this guy Texas Christian invented that formation. He would lose 10,000, 15,000 men in a battle. This is just crazy when you're the South. You can't afford this.
Men that he could not replace.
That's the point. And he hoped, I guess, well, I know, I mean, from what I read, it always says, he hoped that what he would be able to do is destroy the Union Army and knock the Union out of the war that way. He did not understand, according to some experts, that in the modern war, by the Civil War, due to the mini ball rifle, and it was before tanks and airplanes opened up war again in the World War II, the defense had all the advantages, and the attackers are going to be butchered. I mean, the knockout, the reason some people like Alan, what's his name, say that Grant was twice the general is that, of course, Grant had the men, he was a bulldog, he was supposed to be a much better tactician than Lee's lost cause people ever given Grant credit for. They say his Vicksburg campaign was one of the most brilliant in American history. Grant knew and couldn't stand the sight of blood, by the way, wouldn't eat raw, uncooked meat.
Had to be charred.
Charred, yeah. Grant knew that he was going to lose men, but he figured this is what he's got to do, and he can, I guess he figured he can afford the losses because they can be replaced. Lee seemed to have no grasp. He was just destroying the South's manpower.
Does the North get to a point where maybe it can't afford those losses? Can you think of a time, do you know of a time during the war when it becomes a very close thing?
Sure. For the Union side, this is, 1864. Even in the Virginia campaign, he's got to cannibalize his heavy artillery units to make up his losses from like the Wilderness and Spotsylvania and so on.
He sends the heavies out,
Yeah.
and they have no combat.
They have no combat.
I mean, the field.
Trained ground soldiers, they had the best uniforms in the battlefield. And when they were all shot to pieces at Cold Harbor, they could identify them because they had the best uniforms in the army.
During the spring and summer of '64, what is Lincoln doing?
Re-election.
Right.
And what does he think about his re-election chances?
Not good.
No chance. Slim.
What record do we have of that? This is a primary source document. Lincoln writes a memorandum to himself and signs it and puts it in his desk drawer and doesn't tell anybody about it. But he says, given the Democratic platform, given the platform that their candidates are running on, if the Democrats win the election and I leave office in March, I'll have to make the best deal I can, either try to win the war very quickly in the few months remaining, or try to work something out because my successor will immediately arrange peace with the Confederates. But Lincoln underestimates the Democrats. Because they time and again, you can rely on Democrats to pull defeat out of the jaws of victory. They nominate who for president in 1860? George McClellan.
But he was very popular still.
He was very popular, and the day after the Democrats nominate him, Sherman captures Atlanta. Poof. And just before Christmas, he's captured Savannah, which he presents to Lincoln in a telegram, modern communications, with so many pieces of artillery, hundreds of pieces of artillery, and thousands of bales of cotton. Cotton speculators are committing suicide. The cotton that they've been hoarding in New York and London has reached a staggering level in terms of price. And Sherman captures an enormous amount of cotton, and the price plunges.
Michael, it is my understanding that nobody has the least notion what Lincoln meant when he said in that memo, it will be my duty to do whatever it is to get this war over because my successor will have been elected on a platform that will make it impossible for him to pursue it. And of course, one possibility, I guess, but nobody seems to know, is that he would have told Grant, that's it, attack.
Yeah, it's impossible to read the man's mind. He is so often opaque. Can't figure him out. His law partner, Billy Herndon, said of Mr. Lincoln, he always called him Mr. Lincoln in Springfield. He said, when Mr. Lincoln wants to be, he is the most shut-mouthed man I ever knew. And if he shuts up, if he clams up, you cannot get him to tell you what he's gonna do, or what he's thinking, or what he's planning. Played his cards close to the vest, kept his own peace.
It's funny, Michael, I've been reading Supreme Power, which is a book about the attempt to pack the court in 1937. Roosevelt was the same way. The guy was a non-stop talker who would tell you nothing.
Yeah.
And he kept it all to himself.
Let me ask you about the role of women in this war. How important are women to the war efforts, North and South? Martha?
There was a woman who I believe worked, and I don't mean Clara Barton, she did something with the northern troops, and Ulysses Grant said, she outranks me. I don't
That's
remember.
Mother Bickerdike, and it was Sherman who said she outranks me. And in fact, it's Mother Bickerdike who leads Sherman's army in the Grand Review in Washington in May of 1865. She was the real deal.
Yeah.
Think about Clara Barton, tireless self-promoter. Barton was hardly the only woman who was hit by small arms fire during the war. And there are many women, North and South, who are on the battlefield, who are working in hospitals, but far more than just, hospital nurses. 20,000 women in the North, it's estimated, over 20,000 are doing all kinds of war-related jobs for the Army, and probably 10,000 in the South.
Something also I didn't know is that the first psychiatric hospital was opened, I believe, just after the war, St. Catherine's in Washington, D.C.
I think you might mean St. Elizabeth.
St. Elizabeth.
That's where Hinckley is. That's where they kept Ezra Pound after World War II. Didn't kill anybody, but he was anti-Semitic, and he wrote Nazi propaganda. So after the war, they put him in a cage, light on 24/7, and that's where they kept him. Sort of like the character in Silence of the Lambs, Hannibal Lecter.
There's one other question I'd like to ask. I'll throw this out there. I belonged to a Civil War group about 20 years ago, and I was told very possibly the first casualty of the war was buried right at St. Bellevue Cemetery in Lawrence. His name was Sumner Needham. Is that
Killed in Baltimore?
He was
That's a-
one of
that's a
the,
draft riot. There's a
in the
draft
sixth,
riot.
in the sixth mass, he was one of the ones that was killed.
Yeah, I've heard he's the first casualty of Civil War.
I don't know
One of the
about
early ones.
that, he was certainly, yeah, and
Sumner
he wasn't
Needham.
the only one killed
I
that
just
day,
read
so-
somebody in Fort Sumter was the
Yes.
first casualty.
I think it was the next day when they were firing their 100-gun salute.
And
I
it
think
was
They
a
were firing a
friend-
salute and cannon burst.
Yeah.
That was Private Daniel Huff.
Right.
It was a friend of,
H-O-U-G-H.
it was a friend of Lincoln's, or somebody who was very close to.
That was, what was his name again?
Ellsworth. Yeah, I'm not sure that this guy was, but you never know, everyone's the best friend of Lincoln sometimes. Yeah.
He had a lot of them.
Yeah.
What about the role played by black troops? How significant is that?
Very significant.
Why, George?
Yes, because the battles going on at the time, the Union was losing more troops than the South in battle. The Southern troops were, I won't say better fighters, but like you stipulated, they did a lot on defense, and they killed a lot of Union troops, so the number of Union troops was going down, and they figured now was the time to, the abolitionists up here in down in Massachusetts decided, it would be a good time to introduce the black troops into the war. It would give the Union a needed advantage. And it did. It really did. I mean, a lot of historians I have a two-set volume of the history of the rebellion. It was written in 1867, and it kind of like skims over that. But the black troops were very, very important, and it's one thing that a lot of people don't really know about. Their contribution, and it was very significant, even though they were trying to be given less money, trying to be put as portrayed as contraband. It was a tough situation for them, but they proved that they could. It proved to the so-called leadership in the armies, that they were willing and able to fight. And that was a very important thing to the Northern Army.
There's some books on the reading list that detail that story, that subject. A couple of places put on your bucket list. We were talking about Gettysburg. If you haven't been to Gettysburg, I would urge you to go and spend as much time as you can there. It is literally holy ground. And another place, much more recent to go to, and it was built, you know, it took a lot of people, a lot of agitating, a lot of lobbying to get it built, but there is a relatively new African-American soldier and sailors memorial in D.C., right on a metro stop. I think it's P Street or Q Street, but you come up the escalator out of the metro stop, and it's right in front of you as you come outside. It is just amazing.
You know, one of the great.
Oh, go ahead, Dean.
No, I didn't know. Go ahead.
Well, I'm obviously, when you start talking about the black soldiers in the Civil War, I love the 54th. But I think, to me, it seems like the whole idea especially for Northerners, was besides all the other business about how they were going to respond in war, in battle. I mean, which was, to me, is always silly, because they fought in the American Revolution. There were blacks in the American Revolution.
Absolutely.
There were blacks in every war that this country had ever had, even to that point. But I think what it did, I would think, is that people who were sitting there, who'd been first soldiers that had gone to Sumter, and they were trying to get people to come into the military, I think it only made sense, and it gave people a better feeling about it, to actually see black troops defending their own and fighting for their own freedom as well. I think that had to be a big aid to the Republican administration, and they obviously performed very well, even though they took some very serious casualties in some, but they apparently performed very well, and it kind of changed. Of course, it changed the whole idea of those people who still somehow felt that African Americans could not perform in battle. It certainly changed that thinking. But I think it's important that they were out there fighting for their own freedom. I think that did a lot for people. That they were dying for this cause as well.
Yeah, I think today at Remembrance Day at Gettysburg, they do on the Friday before the parade, on the actual, which might not be the date of to Gettysburg service there. They do now invite people to go and pay homage to the African American community soldier that died there. And I don't remember doing that like 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I could be wrong, but has anybody else gone to that ceremony?
I haven't. I know in the Grand Review of the Union Armies in May in Washington in '65, the black troops were not invited.
But they do invite the public to come over and pay homage.
Black soldiers were the honor guard transporting Lincoln's coffin from the U.S. Capitol to the train station to take him home, but they weren't invited to march in the Grand Review.
Right.
Helen, you had a comment?
Well, I just really want to recommend a book called Diary of a Contraband, and it's about an African-American sailor. And for some reason, he knew how to write. And because it was against the law to teach them. And, but he kept a diary, and he was William B. Gould I and William B. Gould IV. They found his diary. It was almost thrown out. And it's a twofer, because you get, it's a threefer, because you get the story of the whole Gould family, but you also get the life of a sailor in the 19th century, and also this is a man who escaped as a slave, and then served as mostly as a blockade runner, but then also they were disappointed that they couldn't get the Alabama because the Kearsarge had already gotten it. But then thirdly, he came back to Nantucket, married a freed African-American woman there, moved to Dedham, was involved with all of these things, so it's his whole life. And so it's actually on the internet too. William Gould IV insisted that it be put on the internet, but it's available in paperback. and it's remarkable just because all that you get out of it.
George, you had a comment?
Yeah, let's not forget that the South introduced black troops into the war too.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, but they were mostly digging the trenches and,
You know, the Navy,
yeah.
which is which for 150 years was a hotbed of racism and anti-Semitism, had more black sailors as a percentage and so forth than were in the, and earlier on. If you take a look at the picture, there's a famous picture of the men on the Monitor. You'll see quite a few African-American faces. And the Monitor, remember, was sunk by 1862, late 1862. So the Navy was a little bit different than the Army.
If I'm not mistaken, too,
Still is.
I think,
Well, that would be another, but it's much better.
if I'm not mistaken, I think also too, black sailors always got equal pay with white sailors, if I'm not mistaken, in the US Navy,
believe
which is
so.
not true about the Union Army.
They had
No,
been
at
in
least
the
not from
Navy
beginning.
before the war.
Right, but it also too, I mean, I think, plus, it makes sense to do that, because it takes a lot more to train a sailor than it does to train an infantryman.
One last sort of question for you. What's the legacy of the war? What should we tell our children, our grandchildren, our students, our friends and neighbors? You know, why is this war important? Or is it still important? Does it matter? Why are you here today?
It's American history. I mean, this is unique. The Civil War is very unique.
It righted the wrongs of the Constitution of not all men are created equal. It wasn't true, and it wasn't true to 1960 and even today. I mean, it's we're seeing this. You know, you're seeing it with how you treat gay people, how you treat Latin America. You know, Latins coming into the country. We're a much better country than we were, and that defined us as a country that we had to do what was right morally.
I agree with that. I think really, a lot of the things that, in fact, we, as we're indicating, the slavery issue wasn't one that started after they stopped importing slaves in 1820. It was always there, but it was one that they couldn't address because you wanted the South on board, of course, and you were talking about taking their property. And so it was one that they couldn't really deal with, but we knew that morally and even on national consciousness, that it was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
It was against what we were supposed to represent, what the Revolutionary War was supposed to represent. And so I think something was gonna have to happen eventually, and this was really the great kind of conflagration that really started to set us on the course that we should have been, things that weren't done when the nation was founded. And of course, it still took time. It didn't resolve all issues, but at least it set us on the right course as a nation. I think that's my humble opinion.
Yeah, I agree. The whole legal system was at stake.
Yeah.
Would have failed.
Well, that's an important point because, Mike, why don't you address the fact that it is widely thought that had the Union permitted secession to occur or not won the Civil War, it was only a matter of time until North America would have been nothing but a bunch of little Balkans.
And that's what the European elite was hoping. This great commercial and economic power that was driving the British merchant marine below water would split apart. They predicted in 1776 and 1787 that such a republic could never endure. In 1861, this was still an experiment.
True.
It's an experiment today.
Isn't that what globalism is? They still don't want the United States to be the power that it is.
We're a threat.
And naturally, apropos of the Balkanization, the French with Maximilian went into Mexico about what, 1864?
And we sent all of the black troops in the Union Army to guard the Mexican border and also occupy Texas during Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Tough job, both of them.
Yeah.
The second especially. Well, I want to close and just urge you to observe the next 4 years, to urge your neighbors, your friends, your acquaintances, your family members, The next 4 years, we are commemorating something very, very important. And think about the strength it took and the strength that was sacrificed. Think about Mr. Lincoln. In 1865, he went down to the trenches at Petersburg to visit General Grant and talk strategy and tell him what to do. And he was still able to demonstrate to the enlisted men a trick that he was doing in Illinois growing up. He could hold full-size axe by the butt end, just grabbing it with his fingers like this. And unlike me, because I don't pump iron, he could hold it out an arm's length for quite a while without trembling. Incredible individual. It wasn't the axe, but it was that strength that I think helped ultimately decide this contest. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it. Well done. You answered all the questions and more.
Years. Why would 75,000 men volunteer to serve in the Union Army? They weren't being drafted, they weren't being conscripted, they were asked to volunteer. And some of it is a history going back to the Revolutionary War, a choice of service to preserve the lifestyle we've become accustomed to, preserve the freedoms that we have. And even today's military, not so much Vietnam, because as you said then, people were burning their draft cards. But today's military is an all-volunteer force. And why would people volunteer? There are economic incentives. A number of people getting their college paid for by serving, but it still comes down to a choice to serve. And why would you do that?
Is it adventure?
Well, I think also, at least in the early part of the war, you know, when the war first began, you can't discount the fact that, you know, many of them signing up are very young. This is the first time they're going to be away from home. They're going to get a fancy uniform, presumably, a weapon. It's the whole, you know, 19th century Victorian romantic concept of warfare, you know. And even today, things haven't changed, at least with respect to, you know, when 19 and 20-year-olds go off to war, for the most part, they don't think they're going to die. You know, they tend to think they're immortal. So I think in the first, when the rush to the colors, you had a lot of very naive people that really didn't know anything about war going off to fight this thing. And then, of course, when you get into the real slaughter, when, you know, we get to, you know, Fredericksburg and all that, and enlistments go down, and then shortly after, certainly after Gettysburg, you have to start drafting people to come in. You know, the dynamics change. So I think the question has to be phrased, you know, the same question proposed to the first part of the war and into the second half of the war, because, you know, like I said, after Gettysburg, you know, there's a real dynamic changes.
Good point. Different motivations depending upon the period, the time. Yeah.
Didn't most of the people envision that this thing was going to be over in 90 days anyways, that there wasn't going to be a 4-year term or a year term? I was going to go take care of business and I'd be home before you knew it.
A lot of people on both sides, many of them not in uniform, many of them would never be in uniform, the chicken hawks of their day. Yeah, they thought this was going to be a 90-day war or less.
I have a question. It mentioned in the first half that the Massachusetts militia was reorganized in 1850, around 1850. And I was wondering what would have been the impetus for Massachusetts to feel as though it was threatened militarily in 1850?
John Andrew, when he took office January 1st of 1861, he immediately speeds up this process, but steps were taken even before he took office by people in either elected positions or people that had money, people that had political influence, who feared and or believed that war was coming. So they decided to strengthen and reinforce and not exactly, but reference was made to the caning of Charles Sumner.
That's true.
And he was caned by Preston Brooks of South Carolina, who went through his collection of walking sticks and canes and various. He pulled out something that was flexible. It was made out of gutta percha, South American material, hollow at the core, and it's hard, but it's brittle. And sometimes these canes had, if I can get a dagger out, it seems to be stuck. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, That is an example of the violence that was taking place in Congress increasingly in the late antebellum era in the 1850s. The mainstay of New England textile industry, 800, 900 pound bales of cotton that are being shipped up here by railroad, by merchant ships, and the spindles from textile mills. You can get these at the museum in Lowell. In fact, one of our governors just before John Albion Andrew, perhaps the greatest of all the war governors, John Andrew, a staunch Republican, a lawyer who helped defend John Brown, but his predecessor was Nathaniel Banks, known as the Bobbin Boy of Waltham. If you go to the town common or the city common in Waltham, you can see the statue of General Banks, because he began his life in a textile mill, pulling these off when they were full of thread and throwing them in a basket in the hopper and inserting a new spindle on the machine. My question began our second session, and James McPherson and a number of other historians have wrestled with the subject in the past 15 or 20 years, is the question of motivation. Why did these men fight? Why did they join up? Why did they fight, many of them bravely and ferociously, until they're killed or wounded, until the term of service is over, until the war is over? Why did these men fight? Arthur?
I think that goes back to what they were doing before the war actually started. I know, for instance, that in the mills, that was one of my first jobs here 45 years ago. And I said, people that work in a place like this, hot in summer, cold winter, but what was the alternative? Farming. Farming is hard work. And these guys, all of a sudden the bandwagon comes through. There's a pretty girl sitting there, there's plenty of beer, there's something to eat. Join up.
They're in to prove the Massachusetts militia because they thought it was going to be needed very soon.
Did the abolitionists have a hand in that?
No, the abolitionists were still, like Wendell Phillips, insulting the American flag, saying that they couldn't take no pride in being an American, as Garrison was doing, burning the Constitution. Some of the abolitionists are talking about seceding from the slave-holding republic. This is immoral, this is wicked. New England should leave. New England should secede. New England should pull out. They talked about it during the War of 1812, near the end, the Hartford Convention. That kind of was a bust after they got the word of Andy Jackson's victory at the Battle of New Orleans. But the abolitionists did not think that slavery was going to be destroyed by this war. They did not think that this was a good thing. And most of them are apolitical. They're not involved in politics. They're anti-political.
What would have been the motivation for people to want to be in a more well-trained militia in Massachusetts? The average person, I mean, the question is, why were people willing to fight the war? Or why, in the first place, why would somebody have been willing 10 years before the war began to start organizing and become involved in a militia? I mean, somehow that mindset must have been planted years before the war started.
Just as white Southerners, and especially slaveholders, feared, the abolitionists feared that these fanatics from the North were going to take their slaves, or free their slaves. There are people in the North who are very afraid of these violent, rapacious, fanatical states' rights, pro-slavery fire eaters, and the fear that their way of life up here in New England, as far north as Massachusetts, conceivably might be threatened. That we might have to defend our way of life. There was a captain in a Massachusetts regiment early in the spring of 1861, Captain Parker. His ancestor was at Lexington Common on Patriots' Day. And the first shots were fired. It wasn't up in New Hampshire. It was right here in Massachusetts. Captain Parker he had a company of men from Lexington and surrounding towns, and there was a West Pointer there, some young pipsqueak, and he was out drilling the troops and cursing, just blood-curdling curses. And some of the men complained to Captain Parker. He's about 58 or something. He's quite elderly. So he confronts this young lieutenant, and he says, "Stop cursing at my men. In the military regulations, it says officers are not to curse men." And the young captain said, "Well, what do you know? What do you know?" And Captain Parker said, "Sir, I know that if I order my men to leave the drill field, they will obey my orders, and you will have no men to command." He died in 1864 in the siege of Petersburg. He was the real deal. His men loved him, he loved them, he led them until he died.
You know, Michael, I think part of the answer also may be, it is conventional to say, but true, that we are besieged with ways of amusing ourselves. This wasn't true in the 1840s and 1850s. And joining marching companies with the snappy drill and the uniforms, this was a form of fun back in those days. And the Southerners, you know, you read about the Richmond Rays and the Washington artillery and all that. What's the first guy who got killed on the Union side who drilled the Zouaves? Ellsworth, thank you, yeah. These guys would go, Ellsworth took his company of drillers around the country, you know, and they would perform and so forth. You know, and it's also a little known fact. You know, the South was a very violent place, or so it is said.
It was.
And the cold duello reigned, duels. And the South early on got the idea that it was going to have to fight. So they not only had marching companies, military companies, call it what you will, but around the 1840s and 50s, a huge number, apparently, a huge number of military academies sprang up. And having once gone to a military academy and loved it, oh, I wish I had been there. But anyway, that's when you got, for example, I believe the Citadel, isn't it, Michael?
I think the Citadel goes back to the
Goes
Mexican
back to
War.
Okay, but there were a lot of military academies that sprang up in the South, or so I have read, you know, and that was because they thought they're going to have to fight someday. Now, one thing that wasn't answered, you might approach, deal with this. People here talked a lot about why the Northerners fought. I guess it's self-evident why the Southerners fought.
Well, there have been all kinds of books done on it recently. Motivation, combat, why men fought on both sides. Someone referred earlier to Professor McPherson speaking at the law school some years ago. I was present with high school teachers from Maine and New Jersey. People traveled hundreds of miles
to service, and they a lot of them couldn't read. They probably didn't know how to march.
They certainly didn't know how to march.
What's that?
They didn't know how to march, that's for sure.
Oh, well, you know, after a while. But this was really, other than the farm, the first job that they probably had, and they were taught what to do and not to ask questions. And once they were in there, and I think they saw the horror of what went on in the battlefield, what else could happen?
One soldier described charging the enemy, and he said it was like being in a moving box. You had men in front of you, behind you, on both sides. There were sergeants keeping the file straight. There were officers behind you. Maybe an exceptionally brave or perhaps stupid officer would be in front of you, but there was no way out of this moving box. Once the box starts moving, you really have no choice but to go forward. You're not a man anymore, you're just part of a machine. Somebody else had a, yeah, Lev?
A lot of these soldiers and volunteers came from the same village, and they had men on either side of them that were neighbors and friends, and they weren't about to cut out and have somebody carry that story back that this guy was a traitor or a coward.
Showed the white feather.
The white feather, and the incentive, that incentive continues today in the military. The thing is, I know from the Marine Corps, you never leave a buddy out there. It's always this buddy system. I mean, and that's why, and I think that's why a lot of men go into combat, you know, they know that they could get hurt or killed, but they're worried about the opinions of other men on themselves. And I think that was even more so back then, in that Civil War, and Revolutionary War too.
Yeah, it's like a bond, it's D-Day, you know, they were gonna fight with their soldier, like you said, with their buddy. I mean, it was a bond that you formed, that they weren't gonna turn around and leave the only person they had in the world at that moment was the person next to them, behind them. You know, they're going forward until they're told. And like you said, they're a machine. They forget about their humanity. They're gonna kill, they're gonna pillage, and they're gonna do what they're told and follow everyone else, and then deal with the consequences later.
Jim?
If you deserted, you were shot or killed if you didn't make it, so there's an incentive as well.
Yeah.
Not like now when they throw you in military prison.
An incredible number deserted on both sides, North and South, but the South could afford the desertion, the hemorrhaging of their course, less than the North could. Dave?
Maybe I misinterpreted the question, but my understanding of what you were asking is why would people choose to serve? You said Lincoln asked for 75,000 volunteers.